I think I should begin by thanking Taka for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank Professor Jason Lacey for inviting me. Thank you so much to the Asian Pragmatism Network. I am really happy and I appreciate what you're trying to do. Let me quickly share my screen and I can begin. Please do tell me if the screen is not visible to you. I think it should be visible now. All right, so let me begin straight away by sort of talking about today's topic. What I'm going to do is present a version, an enriched version of republicanism, or a critique of republicanism. You could actually think of both these as part of the same project. This is a reconstruction of some of Ambedkar's views on the topic, and I am trying to sort of come up with some new ideas based on writings of Ambedkar that I have recently come across, and these are unpublished writings, so I'll say more about that as I go along. Let me first begin by sharing 3 quotations with you. Okay. Yeah. So this is from Bertrand Russell in The History of Western Philosophy, and he's talking about social change. And what he says here is very interesting. He says, there is an example of a general principle, a philosophy developed in a politically and economically advanced country, which is in its birthplace little more than a clarification and systematization of prevalent opinion, may become elsewhere a source of revolutionary ardor and ultimately of actual revolution. And I think this is true in the Indian experience as well. In the 18th century, we saw a lot of social movements in India, especially from the state where I am from, and another place called Bengal, where the new elite or the middle classes, as they were emerging, after their coming into close contact with Western ideas, started looking back at their society, and they thought that there was something amiss in their own moral and cultural landscapes, and they wanted to improve it. So there was a silent revolution of sorts in that sense. I have another quote for you, and this is from John Dewey, and it is reported, I think, by one of his students, John Herman Randall. And I suppose this was one of his last formal lectures that Dewey gave to his graduate students. And I think Dewey, what he is trying to do in this particular passage is that he's saying that the greatest idea of this age is pluralism. And what I understand by this quote is that this is, in some sense, a mission statement for what we do as comparativists. All of us who read 2 or 3 different traditions together, in some sense, are trying to create a conversation between 2 different or 3 different intellectual traditions. But what Dewey is trying to caution us, I think, is in our zeal to unify these ideas or bring them into conversation, we should not forget the particular timbre of voice that every tradition brings. We should not, in our zeal to homogenize things, not lose the particularities. And this gives me an in, so to speak, to think about Ambedkar and Dewey in interesting ways, especially with regard to the question that I have in mind today, which is his critique of Republican freedom, or his enrichment of Republican freedom, as I thought of it. The last quote is by Ambedkar himself, and he's talking about in his championing of an anti-caste society. He says that I'm prepared to pick and choose from everyone, socialist, communist, or other. I do not claim infallibility. And as the Buddha says, there is nothing infallible, there is nothing final, and everything is liable to examination. So in some sense, this adds, for me, another layer to what Russell and Dewey are trying to tell us, that for many philosophers, especially those who are engaged in their societies as reformers, Ambedkar certainly was one of them, philosophical ideas are more urgent to some of them than to other people, in the sense that philosophical ideas offer the tools to create a new world. And in some sense, I think this quotation by Ambedkar complements the 2 passages that I read out before. But I'll have more to say about this later in the course of the paper. So in this paper, I'm trying to do one or two things. The first is I am trying to reconstruct Ambedkar's ideas, his critique of untouchability vis-a-vis slavery. And I'm trying to suggest that this can be seen as an alternative view of freedom. We might as well call it a theory of freedom if we choose. And the way I read it is that this can fruitfully be seen as a version of positive liberty. So what I'll do is I'll first start by positioning Ambedkar as a Republican thinker who is critical of classical Republican liberty, what is called the neo-Roman view of liberty. Ambedkar, as we know, was a great admirer of the French Revolution. He spends a lot of time talking about the values of the French Republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And he has an interesting take on these ideas, especially in the Indian context, and how they apply to his own community, which is that of the Dalits. But I want to suggest that he, in some sense, is not a blind supporter of these values or the underlying sort of undergirding theory of republicanism. And he sort of pushes it by inviting us to think seriously about its applicability in a context like India, where the caste system oppresses and marginalizes millions and millions of people, his own community, the Dalits. So I'm going to use Philip Petit's theory of non-domination as a reference. Somehow I thought that the best way to do that would be to take the most developed form of Republican liberty that there exists in the literature. And then I'm going to ask why the standard Republican model falls short, especially in the case of India. And as a result, I'll also say that Ambedkar's comparison of slavery and untouchability allows us a possibility to think of Republican liberty in newer and more fresher forms. So I'll say that these are the limits of non-domination as Ambedkar sees it. And the alternative model of freedom that I would suggest is what I call freedom as growth. All right, so I begin, in order to introduce Republican liberty, I'll have to sort of say why the Republican view of liberty is so intuitive. And the best way to do that is by comparison. And I have there a caricature of Isaiah Berlin. Berlin was the great liberal thinker of the 20th century. His essay, Two Conceptions of Liberty, is very famous and justly read even today. And there's a passage in that paper when he says, liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness or justice or human happiness or a quiet conscience. And although this seemed intuitive to me, we have the word liberty for a particular idea of called liberty or freedom. In Hindi, we might say azadi or swatantrata, or we might say swaraj, self-rule. The reason why we have these words for different ideas sort of suggests to us that these words pick out actual entities or actual ideas, actual values in the world out there. But I want to caution this kind of way of thinking about liberty, and I draw on some of John Dewey's ideas later on in the paper. As of now, I want to suggest that these ideas come out of a certain tradition of thinking about philosophy of language. And Berlin was a contemporary, I should say, a student or an acolyte, perhaps also of John Austin. And Austin was the famous ordinary language philosopher at Oxford between the 30s and the 60s. And there was this idea that Austin had, which another philosopher, Abram Stroll, calls the ontological applicability principle. And this is a big word for a very simple idea, which is that the various distinctions that we have in our language actually pick out ideas or entities in the world out there. There seems to be almost a one-to-one correspondence between the kind of language, the terminology that we use, the finer and finer distinctions of our terms of use that we employ in daily life, with something out there in the world. And he says that this applies in some sense to the realm of values as well. and political values as well. Now, I do agree that this is useful. This is a useful way to think about perhaps a question like perception in philosophy, maybe a question like realism or irrealism or idealism. But Berlin's use of this idea, or his implicit use at least, he wrote this article in 1959. He was still under the grip of ordinary language philosophy, is what I'm postulating here, what I'm assuming here. Berlin's use of this idea in the political sphere is kind of questionable. And that is why he comes up with this sort of assertion that liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness. We should try and sort of pigeonhole liberty in its own pigeonhole, and equality should be kept separate from it, and dignity and happiness, a quiet conscience, should be kept separate from it. And I think that, and I'll try to show this later on in the essay in the paper, that this perhaps is not true to human experience. We do not think of liberty as, in some sense, separate from dignity or equality. Just to sort of anticipate the later critique that I'm going to make, if I say that I am completely free, as is everybody else in my society, but other people are treated with more dignity than I am, then am I completely free because I have less dignity? Or I am treated not as equally, although I am free in every other sense. Am I indeed free? So in some sense, these ideas impinge on each other in very interesting ways, and this kind of clean separation between values is not something that we should countenance. So Berlin also had this major idea in his paper that liberty can be distinguished between negative liberty and positive liberty. And for the purpose of this paper, I'm going to use the word negative liberty as equal non-interference. So let me just explain what non-interference and negative liberty are. This is the idea that I'm free to do something if nobody interferes in my plans, in my projects. If I want to move from point A to point B, if somebody comes in my way and interferes and stops me, then I am unfree. And this is Hobbes's idea in the Leviathan in the 17th century. In some sense, this Hobbesian image of causing constraints or a barrier in front of a person when he wants to move gets translated into other realms also. So, for instance, in the emotional realm also, if I have a desire to be a singer and my parents stop me from becoming a singer, then in that sense I'm unfree. If I want to be intellectually think some nice thoughts and somebody stops me, the government or another entity or society stops me, I'm unfree. And you can multiply this in different ways. The idea is that some external entity, Y, prevents me from doing something which I want to do. And Berlin had this sort of critique, very influential critique in his time, of positive liberty. And this is the idea that positive liberty goes above and beyond in a kind of unjustified manner than negative liberty. What positive liberty postulates is that my current state is not my true state. I'll be truly free or truly equal or truly myself when I attain that other state. So currently I'm living in a kind of false consciousness, or currently I'm living in a kind of state which is not true to me as a human being, or currently I am not engaged in self-rule. I am in some sense living falsely, not truly enough. So only a life trajectory which allows me to reach that final stage, in some sense, is worth thinking about, and achieving that would give me true liberty. So Berlin says that this has the possibility of allowing a tyrant to tell you that, look, you don't know because you are living in false consciousness, or you don't have complete access or complete knowledge. So let me tell you, and I will impose true liberty upon you. So it has a totalitarian element to it. And of course, we know that Berlin was not really only writing as somebody who's a middle-class academic at a great university. He was also hobnobbing with people who were part of the higher echelons of power in the United States and Britain. He was associated with the CIA. He was also a critic of the Soviet Union. And all of that influenced his writing to some extent. And Nancy Hirschman, another great political philosopher, has noted that in her work, as have others. So I want to suggest that bracketing Berlin's personal, historical, and political predilections to one side, let's take his ideas seriously, but let's try and sort of push back against Berlin, as other people have tried to do. And I suggest that Ambedkar's vision of freedom as growth is one of those ways in which we can rescue positive liberty. We don't have to assume a metaphysically laden version of liberty or growth. We can carry on with a very down-to-earth, commonsensical, functional version of growth, freedom as growth, as I put it, and can, in some sense, rescue positive liberty from Berlin's critique. So this was negative liberty or freedom as non-interference for you. The idea is that, as I said, I am free when I am not interfered by any entity or thing or agent Y from doing Z. And in this case, X is I, or any entity which wants to be free. So this is non-interference. Of course, in this mathematical formulaic sense that I define freedom as a triadic relation, I put it there especially because we can think about freedom as growth when we actually lay it down. We can think about that as well in this interesting way. So I want to insist that negative liberty can be sort of uncoupled from this triadic relation that I have on the screen there. And that was a very good contribution by a philosopher called Gerald McCallum, who sadly died very early. So now the foil for Ambedkar's own idea of freedom as growth, which is the Republican idea of freedom as growth. Now, I want to suggest to you that non-domination or republicanism is very intuitive. It's a very commonsensical way to think about freedom. And in a sense, it's a critique of the liberal view of freedom. And Philip Pettit, the great political philosopher, one of the best people writing on this topic for the last 20 years, has a very interesting image for us to think about non-domination in his book, Freedom, a Moral Compass for a Complex World, which is not an academic book, it's a trade book put out by a trade publication, not an academic university press. But it, in some sense, synthesizes many of his ideas from his earlier work, Republicanism, and later a later work called Democracy for Democratic People or something like I can't remember, but okay, let me just move on. So in this book, he has this very interesting image, which he borrows from this 19th century novel by Henrik Ibsen called A Doll's House. There you can see a still from a film, very, very well-made film starring Anthony Hopkins called A Doll's House as well. I would recommend that you watch this film or read the novel to understand more about Nora's situation. So Philip Pettit puts up Nora as an example of somebody who seems free on the liberal view, who seems free on the non-interference model. So what is Nora like? Nora is basically a housewife. She is the lady of the house. She's married to a wealthy banker called Torvald. Nora can do whatever she wants. Torvald does not interfere with her. She's cared for and nurtured. Torvald dotes on her. She's spoiled. He does not forbid her anything except for macaroons, which are these nice fluffy sweets, I suppose. I've never had a good macaroon ever in my life, but I'm told they're really, really really good when well made. So she is allowed to do anything that she wants to do except from eating macaroons. But even that is not a problem because she can hide macaroons in her skirt and eat them when she likes. So in a sense, it looks like she is free. She can associate with whoever she likes. She can go to the market whenever she wants. She has a chauffeur-driven cart. She can travel around town. She can meet her relatives when she wants. So Pettit suggests to us that Nora is free on the non-interference view, on the liberal view. But then very quickly, if I were to suggest this idea that Nora is free to a 16-year-old or to a 12-year-old perhaps, they might also come back and say that, is she indeed really free? They might question that. Why? Because Nora is in potestate domini, which is just another way to say that she is living under the power of a dominus, a master. In this case, the master is the husband, Torvald. So if Torvald changes his mind, if he changes his will, suddenly decides not to be so sweet, her life will completely change. She will no longer feel free. She will no longer feel non-interfered or uninterfered, because her quality of life will just completely change. She will have to ask perhaps Torvald for every little thing that she hitherto was able to do without interference. So Petit's idea is that non-interference isn't enough for us to think about liberty. When thinking about liberty, we should think about the case of a person who is never in any arbitrary power by a superior, by a master. So this idea is that you are never under arbitrary power of a dominus, which is just the Latin word for master. And Petit and Quentin Skinner, who is the other great political historian or philosopher who's done the most to resuscitate the Republican model of thinking about freedom, they both say that this has been, in the Western tradition at least, the classical form of thinking about freedom, which was only displaced in the 18th century by the likes of Jeremy Bentham and Thomas Hobbes and their followers, they call the liberals. All right. So now I come to the more juicy part of the conversation of this talk today, thinking about Ambedkar himself and how he may have a problem with this. In fact, he does have a problem quite categorically with this neo-Roman Republican version of thinking about freedom. And I want to suggest to you that especially when Ambedkar thinks about the freedom of the untouchable, which is the caste which is outside of the fourfold caste system, which is in some sense the pariah peoples of India, who live in the southern part of the village, who live away from everybody else, who in some sense do not have any close contact with the rest of their society. When we think about those people, that is when we really push the Republican understanding or analysis of freedom to its, yeah. All right. So why republicanism is not enough when thinking about caste oppression? This is because republicanism asks, are you secure against arbitrary interference? Whereas Ambedkar's critique is that this way of thinking about freedom is in some sense structurally biased towards juridical relations, which is just a fancy way of saying that there are some kinds of law-like relationships which the law creates, that of the master and the slave. The slave is in some sense justifiably or legally, if not legitimately, legally owned by the master. Only when we think about that sort of a relationship, that of master or slave or sovereign or subject, the sovereign especially is the person or the placeholder, the king or the queen, who in some sense creates the law or gives legitimacy to the law because she or he is the being from whom the law emanates. So only when we think about legal relationships does the Republican critique make sense. But there are so many spheres, domains of life, especially in the East or in non-Western cultures and regions, where this might not actually be applicable. So it struggles with the following. It struggles with caste-based violence and untouchability. In the last talk, we had Professor Scott Stroud, who discussed the case of the caste system and Ambedkar's sort of influenced by pragmatism and his critique. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that. He has done a wonderful job sort of setting up even my conversation and any other conversation that is going to talk about Ambedkar and pragmatism. So I'm not going to do that, but here is just to say that Ambedkar's reading of Dewey and the pragmatists in some sense enables him to level this critique against republicanism. The idea being that republicanism cannot make sense of the following kinds of relationships, caste relationships and untouchability, but also something like racial segregation, especially when it is sustained by custom. It does not have to be a juridical figure or a person inhabiting a master relationship which imposes that kind of violence. Patriarchal norms embedded in traditional families, even if there is no patriarch in the family and he has passed away, those patriarchal norms in some sense already sort of structuring the relationship between members of a household, and they are internalized by even the female members of the household. So republicanism cannot make sense of those norms. I would go on to suggest that even economic marginalization, where we cannot we cannot identify a clear dominator can again not be made sense of by republicanism. So people living in a capitalist society, which is highly and the proletariat feels constrained by capitalist mode of exchange, and they cannot escape it. There is no exit from the system. There is no one particular dominus that they can look at. There is no one legal relationship between one master, one capitalist, and one slave, which is dominating them. In some sense, the whole economic system is dominating them. So republicanism cannot make sense of all of this. But I do point out, based on my current readings, I found one article by Rafiq Hassan, who's a very articulate critic of republicanism and also a Republican himself, who says that republicanism in some sense can account for structural dominance. But I will point out that this literature exists, but I will not engage with it now because it will take me in an entirely different direction, which I don't want to get into right now. All right, so let me say a little bit about the historical background in which Ambedkar makes this rather interesting critique of republicanism. Ambedkar is not a university professor. He's not an academic like you and I. He is not up to date with all of the recent publications on a particular topic. So why is he interested in this particular topic? The simple reason is that he is the leader of the untouchables and he wants to champion their emancipation. But more proximately, the reason why he engages in this critique is because of two publications in India in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, I suppose, which came out, which discussed and took on these ideas head on. One was this rather polemical exchange between two individuals, Catherine Mayo, who's an American feminist, I suppose you can say, American liberal, but also a campaigner for anti-immigration. She does not want immigration from non-white societies into India, so she is, in a sense, a kind of a racist. But she writes multiple books on multiple topics. Two of them are of interest to us. One was her sort of survey of the situation of people in Philippines, because Philippines was under the influence of the United States, has been for the last 150 years or so. And the other was India. So she turned her attention to India as well and writes this book called Mother India, where she basically critiques almost every part of Indian culture, and especially Hindu culture. So she critiques and criticizes rather harshly Indian mysticism, the figure of the Indian patriarch, the karta or the man of the house, the person who leads the joint family. She critiques Indian religion and mysticism, especially for the way they, in some sense, emaciate or emasculate Indian manhood, and also all in the name of religion and all in the name for some higher value. And also her most important critique is about the condition of women in India. As you can see, the cover page or the first page of her book has a woman and her child, and she's basically trying to highlight the bad condition of women, and she blames only Indians for this. So in that sense, she is also an imperialist who's suggesting that India's faults are not the faults of Britain or her colonization, but Indian society itself. It's a polemic. It became really popular. It really hit a nerve. So a lot of people responded to it in many ways. If you can't read the whole book, I would recommend that you read the New York Times review of the book, which came out, I think, a year or two after the book. It's still available on the website, and it's a fascinating insight into what she was trying to do. The more it gets interesting when leader of the Indian national movement, Lala Lajpat Rai, who's a Punjabi sort of upper caste Hindu man, who also spends time in the United States and sort of engages with trying to create an internationalist movement against colonialism, and is talking to Black activists, African American writers and intellectuals. He picks up his pen and wants to level a critique of Miss Mayo. And the reason why Gandhi is on the picture there is because he is a supporter of Gandhi, and Miss Mayo had critiqued Gandhi and the Indian National Congress for their rather harebrained ideas about what India needs, whereas she thinks that India needs more of Western values and needs to shed its own values. So there's a line in Unhappy India where Lala Lajpat Rai says quite provocatively, after noting all of the crimes committed by the West against indigenous people and Black people and all other kinds of colonial peoples in South America. And then he says, what are the crimes that the Indians or the Indian upper caste elite have committed against untouchables that can even compare to what the West has done against all of these other peoples that I mentioned? And I suppose this, in some sense, was the invitation for Ambedkar to pick up his pen and sort of intervene in this debate, because that was, in some sense, just asking for it. Ambedkar is a lot like Marx in one sense, if not in others, which is that if Ambedkar feels slighted or provoked into a debate, then he takes the debater, his interlocutor, head on. And like Marx wrote a very blistering 600-page critique, because one member of the scientific materialists sort of wrote about Marx in an offhand way, and this provoked Marx to write a 600-page work against him. In this case, Ambedkar also entered the fray and wrote a very long book, and this particular chapter, of which we have two versions that we are discussing today. So Ambedkar ended up writing this essay. It's undated, but I suppose my guess is that it was written either in the late 1930s or early 1940s, because there is a publication, a local publication published this essay independently in the 1943. So it can be dated to that time roughly. So what does this paper do? It's titled "Which is Worse, Slavery or Untouchability?" So he takes on the debate in a rather, head-on fashion. And through this sort of comparative analysis between untouchability and slavery, he engages in a philosophical critique of, in some sense, Republican or neo-Roman ideas. The way Ambedkar begins his essay is first by trying to set the terms of the debate clearly. And he says that slavery has been defined in multiple ways. So in order for us to make any purchase on this topic of which is worse, slavery or untouchability, first we have to define what slavery is. And he says that one interesting way to define it, which people find acceptable, and there's a lot of literature on this, is that a slave is a property of another person who is his master. That is one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is that a slave is a non-person in law, whereas the person who owns him is a person in law. And then he says that we'll come to untouchability in a little bit, but let's just go with this sort of working definition of slavery. Based on this definition, an untouchable is clearly not a slave, because he's not a non-person in law, at least by the time Ambedkar is writing this essay. It's already been 100 years or more that slavery in India has been abolished. So he says, let's take untouchability as it is today and compare it with two important cases of slavery in history. And he says, let's take the two cases which we know most about. One is the Roman case, which is ancient Rome, now 2000 or 2500 or so years ago. And the other is American slavery before the Civil War, so American antebellum slavery. And he says, let's compare these two cases, which we know a lot about, with untouchability not, in some sense, correspondent to these ages that we talked about. But let's take untouchability today, because apparently Lajpat Rai says that untouchables are having a very good time right now. And it might have been bad back in the day, but now they're much better off. So he says, let's take the best time, so to speak, of untouchability and compare it with the worst slavery that ever existed. So let me remind you that there are two definitions of slavery that he took. One was that a slave is owned by a master. That is one. A person who is owned by another person is a slave. And the other is slave is a being, an individual who is not a person by law. So Ambedkar says that if we take this definition, then it seems apparently that slavery is worse than untouchability. Why? Because A slave can be, in the most extreme cases, be destroyed by the master. He can kill him. He can sell him. He can dispense with him however he likes. He can injure him, and nobody's going to question him. With an untouchable, of course, if you treat an untouchable like that, at least the British government, as it existed at the time, would take you to court and you will be punished if the government so chooses. Then he says a slave is not a person in law. Untouchable, at least, is a person in law because he can hold property, he can mortgage things, he cannot be purchased and sold in the same way that he can purchase and sell other objects. So again, it looks like slavery is worse than untouchability. But he says this is only on the surface. We have to go behind appearances and see the actual situation, the condition of slaves and untouchables. All right. Taka, how am I doing on time? Am I doing fine on time? Okay, thank you. So he says that untouchable seems to be a person in law, but in actual reality, in his actual lived experience, he is denied personhood. He is denied social personhood. He is denied social recognition. Untouchability, and this is his main case, blocks avenues for a person to communicate with other people in society, to participate in society. It blocks avenues towards dignity and growth in society, which he says rather sort of counterintuitively, the slave had access to. In both these cases that he talks about, which is both ancient slavery and antebellum slavery. And let's look at some of his arguments, okay? So on the right, you see a famous book called Slavery in the Roman Empire. This is the book that Ambedkar quotes in order to make his factual arguments. So Ambedkar is basically engaged in academic debate right from the start. This book is not in print, but I have seen publications as late as the 2000s which still quote this book, and it's not completely repudiated. The arguments in this book are still valid today. So, of course, Ambedkar had access to only to one or two such pieces of literature, so he quotes the best literature available. He says Roman slaves did, in fact, have it better than what we think of in our common parlance, in our common understanding. He says that some Roman slaves at least served as librarians, some of them served as doctors, some were philosophers or were assistants to philosophers, some were secretaries. The word that is commonly used is amanuensis, which is a new word I learned. This is the idea that you do secretarial work for somebody else who is engaged in a profession which requires literary work. So for instance, if I'm a professor and I have a secretary, that person is my amanuensis, and a lot of these amanuenses were slaves. Slaves could be tutors, public administrators. They accumulated something called peculium, which is like earning based on trade that they engaged in. So these were, in some sense, their savings. They also engaged in commerce. He says that he quotes R.H. Barrow to say that Cicero's household was the slaves' republic. And he has these kinds of bombastic rhetorical sort of moves that Ambedkar makes in this essay to say that at least some slaves could engage in activities which would develop them in some sense. And this is not accessible to the untouchables at all. More controversially, he talks about African-American slaves before the Civil War. And he says that some of them functioned as artisans, teachers, skilled craftsmen. Some earned wages comparable to poorer whites. And he quotes examples such as the example of John Chavis, who was a Princeton University educated black man who was the first, I suppose, black graduate of the university, and he started a school for both black and white people. I looked that up, and of course, Ambedkar does not mention this, but even though both black and white people came to his school, they came at different schedules, so they never intermixed. But it is true that at this school, many prominent people in that state used to send their children. So some of them went on to be governors or lawyers or were important people in their own right. So this is true. Ambedkar is actually quoting, in this case, an African-American sociologist called Charles Johnson, who was a contemporary of Du Bois, and I suppose even a rival of Du Bois. But he is quoting an African-American sociologist. So his arguments, in some sense, even though they are controversial, he is quoting good scholarship. So Ambedkar's question is, how many untouchables have been librarians, teachers, or artisans? The question is to Lajpat Rai, and in some sense, he is taking the side of Miss Mayo for other reasons in this debate, and his reasons are that Mr. Lajpat Rai and Gandhi and the Indian National Congress want self-rule for themselves. The imperialist though she is, Miss Mayo is correct that in order to justify self-rule for yourself, you should be able to first sort of defend your culture in as much as how well do you treat people who are in some sense under your power. And these are women and minorities and people from the lower caste. And Ambedkar is saying that perhaps the Indian national movement is not mature enough to buy self-rule for themselves because they're not treating other caste people equally. All right. And the larger question that he's answering is on the question of whether slavery is better than untouchability. He says categorically, it seems that slavery is better than untouchability. Now, should we take this to mean that Ambedkar is in some sense sort of underplaying or underplaying the evil of slavery? I don't think that we should read Ambedkar like that. I want to suggest to you that this is a comparative exercise in which Ambedkar is rather controversially, but still in some sense justifiably claiming that a system of domination can be better than other systems of domination, or less bad or less worse than other systems of domination. And because of certain reasons. And the reason that he gives is that untouchability is social exclusion predicated on religious sanction. It is not just a legal system. In fact, law may have very little to do with it. It's based on social practice more than a legally enshrined system of oppression. So his conclusion is that untouchability is more harmful to the growth of man than slavery ever was. Despite legal disabilities, slave could enter what I call a trajectory of growth. Not all slaves could enter that, but at least some could. So at least in some sense, they could allow for the possibility of having role models for other people in that sort of system of disabilities. You could actually look at somebody like John Chavez. You could look at somebody like Frederick Douglass. You could look at somebody like Booker T. Washington. They are no comparable figures among untouchables, is what Ambedkar is trying to suggest. So it's a foolproof system of domination as compared to slavery, where there is at least a possibility for some people to enter a trajectory of growth. The way I explain it to people who are, let's say, skeptical of this, or people who come from outside of political theory or philosophy, is by quoting a recent Nobel Prize winning economist who, I think last year, their book or their work, Why Nations Fail, basically tried to suggest that even though many countries in the global south experienced colonization, some countries experienced colonization by empires or countries which at least gave them a system of governance or administration of rule of law, which if they applied in their own countries for an extended period of time, started giving them benefits which other countries did not have. So in some sense, even though no benefit or no thanks to those countries, to those colonizing countries, the systems that they ended up applying for their own benefit in a country like India, in some sense allowed India to be a country which was democratic and have rule of law, as compared to some other country, let's say in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, where they ended up not being democracies and not taking human rights seriously. It's a controversial example, a controversial sort of argument, but I still want to suggest that this is the kind of argument that Ambedkar is giving. All right, so Ambedkar's point is that untouchables face total social repudiation. His argument would be that Orlando Patterson's claim that slavery is like social death applies more to untouchables than it ever did to slavery. All right. So hence Ambedkar's core insight, I claim, is that when thinking of freedom, we must pay adequate attention to not just de jure condition, not just the juridical condition, not just your condition in law, not just your condition as a status, whether you are slave or master or anything else, but your de facto condition. How was your actual lived experience? All right. So here now I introduce finally the alternative version of positive liberty that I promised that I would talk about, which is freedom as growth. So I want to suggest, based on Ambedkar's work and my reconstruction of his work and sort of bringing Ambedkar's ideas in conversation with negative and positive liberty, that we should think about freedom as growth, as a more enriched version of republicanism, even though it is critiquing republicanism in some sense. So non-interference is not enough. Non-domination also is not enough. The primary measure of freedom, actually, I want to rephrase that. I want to say that the primary sort of emphasis or the primary cachet when thinking about freedom should belong to this notion of the expansion of human capacities and the enrichment of experience. And also, when we think about whether one society is more free or freer than another society, of course, we are going to engage in comparative analysis and comparative measurings. And Ambedkar's, I suppose, all for it. Or from his arguments, we can glean the idea that we should not think about a society which is purely just or purely free. Or as Philip Pettit says, that you are only free when you can actually pass the eyeball test. I can look at Taka in the eye, and if our eyes meet and I can eyeball Taka, I am as free as Taka is. If I defer to Taka every now and then, I look down, I am not as free. So my status is less than Taka in that sense. So these are the kinds of tests that Philip Pettit is giving. And he says a person should be sui juris. He should be one's own man. He should not be, in some sense, his status should not be predicated on a gift given by another person. All of that is fine. Ambedkar will not say that this is not a good aspiration to have. But he is suspicious of this kind of Rawlsian transcendental institutionalism view of freedom or justice. So in this sense, Ambedkar's view is similar to what Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum claim in their capabilities approach, that we should think about what the next best thing is to achieve. That is what we should aspire to do. And we should have concrete sort of steps in order to achieve that, rather than thinking about this end state view of freedom, which we may never achieve. So what are the conditions of this expansion of human capacities and this enrichment of experience that Ambedkar and Dewey is talking about? And of course, these ideas come from Dewey, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that because I just wanted to save time. And I want to point people to the second, third, and fourth chapters in Professor Stroud's book and his last talk that he gave here, where he actually shows very carefully, through a lot of painstaking archival work and a lot of poring through Ambedkar's notes and manuscripts and speeches, how Ambedkar borrowed these ideas of growth from John Dewey's Democracy in Education and other works. I do some of that in my paper, but for this particular presentation, I am not going to go into that. So what are the conditions for this? The conditions are basically that we should have social arrangements that in some sense permit moral, intellectual, and economic development for all people. So what would it mean for untouchables? It would mean something like access to schools, better access to good nourishment and clean drinking water, more communication between groups and individuals in society, as opposed to what they have, which is isolation and living completely as pariahs. So these are the kinds of concrete things that you need. And only social arrangements which, in some sense, promise you these goods can allow for the possibility of a freer society. Now, when thinking about growth, a quotation from Dewey comes to mind, that when we think about growth, we don't think about endless growth, because only a cancer grows endlessly and mindlessly. So that is not what we think about when we say that we want growth to be the underlying sort of value that we want to commit ourselves to. Growth need not have any fixed telos. Growth is an ongoing process. It's not a final endpoint. There is a lot to be said about this sort of functional view of growth in John Dewey. I want to sort of pivot away from that and talk about Ambedkar and his understanding of growth, which in some sense derives out of Dewey. But in Ambedkar's case, and based on the reading of this particular passage and some of his other writings, I actually have a list of things that would constitute growth. And in some sense, current literature on basic goods in political philosophy, in some sense, is similar to the kinds of things Ambedkar has in mind. And I'll come back to that in the last slide. So coming back to this notion that freedom of growth is a version of positive liberty. In an interesting paper, Charles Taylor writes his critique of Isaiah Berlin, and he says that Berlin says a lot of interesting things that we should be careful about, that this notion of metaphysically laden view of liberty, where I am sort of festering in false consciousness, and a tyrant can actually show me the right path or the right destination that I should reach, is certainly something to be careful about. But there is something wrong with negative liberty as well. And he gives an example of Albania. And he says that, would we say that when visiting Albania, we find few traffic lights compared to Britain, but Albania has complete religious persecution. You cannot actually believe in any religion you like. Is Albania still freer than Britain in some sense? That would be a ludicrous proposition, right? To say that Albania is freer because there are lesser interferences. We have to look at the nature of interference and the kind of thing that something is stopping you from. Traffic lights are not interfering in your life by making you less free. They are ways in order to help you navigate crowded roads. So in that sense, they are actually enriching your freedom. They're allowing you a safe passage. So very interestingly, 50 years before, or more, 50 or 60 years before Charles Taylor made this point in What's Wrong with Negative Liberty, John Dewey in his lectures in China made the same point, that we have to think about the nature of interferences and the nature of encumbrances when talking about whether one system of governance is free or unfree. So I suppose the point has been made, and I'll just move on. I just have two more slides after this, I suppose. So the philosophical sources of Ambedkar, I should say a little bit about this. The way I read Ambedkar, I find the two sources in both Dewey and Bertrand Russell, who was the other great philosopher who also influenced Ambedkar, though not as much. It's important to recognize that the only book review of a book-length work that Ambedkar ever wrote in his life was of Bertrand Russell's The Problem of Social Reconstruction, I think it's called, or something like that. Professor Stroud, again, has written a very nice paper on that. So I point you guys to that if you want to know more about it. So Russell thought of growth as something that institutions cannot enable you to do, but if institutions leave you alone, they, in some sense, are the precondition for growth. And then activity is also a condition of growth. And then he goes on to distinguish between creative impulses and possessive impulses. And we should try to create a society where we enable more creative impulses of cooperation and sort of lessen and reduce more possessive impulses. Dewey, of course, in Democracy in Education and in other works, talks about growth at length and says that growth itself is the only model end, and an idea which finds uptake in Ambedkar, and a line which is very famous and is found in many anthologies as well, is that Dewey's suggestion that we should test social institutions and political institutions and all institutions basically by whether they set free individual capacities, by whether they allow individuals to grow freely or not. All right. And I want to suggest to you that Ambedkar, in some sense, shares both Russell and Dewey's ideas, more so Dewey's, this notion of meliorism, this idea that even though we may not be able to design a perfectly just society, and that whole project itself is suspicious, we should be dubious of anyone who claims that they can design a perfectly just society. But what we can do is to reduce injustice here and now. We can reduce unfreedom here and now, and this is the shared meliorism of all three of these figures. So what is our test for evaluating social arrangements? For Dewey, it was that this all political and social institutions and industrial arrangements shall be, that the supreme test for all these institutions shall be that the contribution they make to the all-round growth of every member of society. And this is an idea that Ambedkar takes very seriously in his later work. So to circle back to the point that I made initially when I began this talk about Isaiah Berlin, that, and let me go back to that. So Berlin here makes a claim that liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness or justice or human happiness or quiet conscience. And I suggested to you that in some sense, Berlin was in the grip of mid-century Oxford philosophy, where they thought that all of the various distinctions in our language, in some sense, pick out actual entities in the real world, whether they be physical entities or values or ideas or thoughts that subsist in the human mind or artifacts of culture. So all of these various sort of discriminating words that we use, in some sense, have a one-to-one correspondence with things actually existing in the world. So liberty is liberty. When we think about liberty, it has an actual state which it is reflecting, and so is equality of fairness. And I want to suggest to you that we should be able to critique now, based on what I've said from Ambedkar's work, that against Berlin and Petit, who both, in some sense, accept this assumption of treating freedom as one value among others and needing boundaries from all other values like equality, dignity, welfare, and so on. Following Ambedkar and Dewey, we should be suspicious of that sort of a claim. Freedom, equality, justice, dignity may all be mutually implicated. The example that I gave, and I turn to again, is this notion that I cannot say that all of us in our society are free if I have less dignity than other people. I cannot say that all of us are free if I am more unequal than others. In some sense, these are ideas which impinge on others. These are values that, in some sense, are related to each other. And an artificial separation of them will distort human experience. So, to close now, I mean, I'm about to end my talk. So I want to suggest that from an Ambedkarist perspective, which is, I want to recommend to you that the word Ambedkarist is an adverb that I use, which is different from Ambedkarite, which has a slightly different connotation in India. Ambedkarites are people who are followers of Ambedkar, and they have their own tradition of thinking, writing, talking, and agitating about rights. So I want to distinguish this particular intervention from that. But I suppose many of them will also agree that from an Ambedkarist perspective, we should ask not so much what my legal status is or what kind of a society do we want in that transcendental institutionalism sense that Rawls, in some sense, suggests to us. But we should ask what developmental pathways are open to me as an untouchable or as a person who lives in the here and now. One should ask, am I socially recognized by others? Is, in some sense, the social recognition by others ameliorating or lessening the disadvantages that the law has, in some sense, put upon me? Can I enter cooperative life as an equal? And finally, in the absence of a dominus, am I precluded from going out of my disadvantages? And this is the kind of suggestion that Ambedkar makes in that great essay, Which is Worse, Slavery and Untouchability? Now, I want to caution you and say that in his more cautious moments, in his more academic moments, Ambedkar gives you this analysis, but sometimes in his more rhetorical moments, and I suppose Professor Stroud would be interested in some of these and has written and will indeed perhaps grace us with more of his writings on these particular moments in Ambedkar's life. Ambedkar is not always consistent. So think about this particular passage, and it's a very interesting passage. He says, democracy is not suitable to India and popular government will not do for her. And of course, Ambedkar is, I suppose, in the post-independence period, very upset by the policies of the Indian National Congress, and he feels that they have, in some sense, failed the untouchables and the Shudras of India by not doing enough for their emancipation. Ambedkar says, India wants a dictator, a Kamal Pasha or a Mussolini. I had hoped that Mr. Gandhi would attain the position of a dictator, but I am disappointed. My complaint is not that Mr. Gandhi is a dictator, but that he is not. Without a leader of the stamp of Kamal Pasha, there will be no salvation for India. Hence, I despair of the future of India. Now, this is, of course, very rhetorical and it sort of reflects the frustration that Ambedkar has with the mainstream of the Indian National Congress. And in some sense, this also sort of allows for the possibility of a critique on the side of the juridical Republicans who say that Ambedkar's ideas are are open to the critique that he does not take juridical relations seriously enough, because he can make this sort of a claim, which in some sense is not a credit to him, because he, in order to allow for the possibility of growth in the here and now, he is able to countenance, at least in his rhetoric, a figure like a dictator like Kemal Pasha or Mussolini. I suppose what he has in mind is that in the Turkish Republic, Kemal Pasha basically abolished all kinds of titles and elite structures of power in one go. One of these examples is that Mustafa Kemal Pasha, the leader of Turkey, or the founder of modern Turkey, basically made it a law that everybody should give up their surnames, their titles, and adopt newer surnames, because the surname itself was a reflection of the kind of title they held during the Ottoman Empire. And in some sense, it made the new republic unequal to start with. So this is the kind of view that I think Ambedkar has, and he wants Gandhi to be a dictator of the sort that I mentioned, especially with regard to the example of the status names. So coming back to McCallum's formula, the triadic formula that I introduced in the second slide, this was the idea that freedom can be explained, or freedom can be sort of characterized as a triadic relationship. I and X am free to do or be a Z when I'm free from Y, from any encumbrances or any interventions or any constraints. Now, this, I want to suggest to you, can be seen quite fruitfully as a general framework covering all theories of freedom. Whatever your view of freedom is, in some sense, I think it can be substantiated in this sort of mathematical formula. I want to suggest to you that Ambedkar's transformation of Republican liberty into freedom as growth would not be a rejection of this schema. We can in fact quite fruitfully sort of transpose Ambedkar's idea into this schema. But what we'll have to do is to reinterpret why. We'll have to reinterpret the impediments. And instead of just saying that Y is a person or a structure or a wall, let's say, or a thing or an obstruction in my path, Y can be expanded to talk about and include social norms, caste hierarchy, any kind of stigma, or any kind of structural domination, and even a kind of situation or state such as poverty or disease, or and the examples can be multiplied. At the same time, we can expand the Z, our ends of freedom, to include not just a final state or freedom or any object that I have. For instance, if I want to reach out to that fan and switch it off, that is the Z, the end that I want to attain. I can sort of expand that to include education, dignity, participation, recognition, so on and so forth, development, leisure, and spiritual fulfillment. So the idea of freedom as growth can be expansive enough to include all of these ends in view, so to speak. So now to conclude, for Ambedkar, freedom as growth is not only an absence of interference or domination, but also, and this is important, a socially mediated expansion of human capacities. And Ambedkar is majorly concerned not with any sort of end state view of freedom, but he's concerned with whether the conditions in the here and now enable or block my development. And I also suggested to Taka in the beginning that we can actually see some of the recent work in the last 30 or 40 years by figures like John Finnis, who's a natural law philosopher par excellence, who comes up with this very interesting inventory of basic goods that I need to truly flourish. And he has his own sort of list. But from Ambedkar's point of view, we can say that I can sort of enter a trajectory of growth when I have access to at least these basic goods. So I am physically free. I'm not under any domination of physical violence or threat of physical violence. I'm not under constant interference. Interestingly, this is the bit that that Berlin would be interested in, but Ambedkar has his own analysis of interference when, especially in his work, The Annihilation of Caste, when he talks about the kind of disabilities that the Balais of India undergo. They are under constant physical threat and interference. We spoke about personal and group development, that not only should I have the avenues of development over to me, but so should my people and the group that I belong to, which in some sense give me my identity. I should have access to avenues of knowledge, vocation, and leisure. Very interestingly, Ambedkar also talks about material goods and money as something which can be seen as a basic good. If everybody else has money and I don't have money, just the comparative non-access to money makes me in some sense less free, and also makes me in some sense deprived. So as opposed to John Finnis, who would say that we cannot think about material goods as a basic good, for Ambedkar, entering the trajectory of freedom and growth would require that if you live in a society which sort of traffics in money, you ought to have adequate amount of money and resources to be truly considered free. I should have access to meaningful choice, access to valued experiences. One very heartbreaking example in The Annihilation of Caste and other books as well by Ambedkar is that of a wedding party which is attacked by upper caste men because they were using clarified butter or ghee while creating the feast, or while preparing the feast for the guests. And the upper caste people attacked them because they thought that ghee is something, or clarified butter is something that only upper caste men should enjoy. So from there, I sort of get this idea that meaningful choice should involve access not just to nutrition, but also to taste, also to valued experiences. This might not be such a big deal to us who have access to all of the goods that we can actually go to the market and buy, but for Ambedkar, this was really important. And yet again, we should think about, even today, when we think about freedom, we should think about them in comparative terms. If some people have access to caviar, let's say, but only some people will ever have access to that, in some sense, I am deprived of certain valued experiences if I value them. If I value them, I should have at least some access to those important goals. He goes on to talk about effective power and political control. The example that he would give is that not only should Dalits be part of governing bodies which govern everybody, including Dalits, but Dalits should have effective control and power over selecting Dalits to represent themselves. And this was his main controversy with Gandhi, who, although was willing to give in the 1932 negotiations with Ambedkar, which the British, in some sense, sort of negotiated between many Indian groups, although Gandhi was willing to give more seats to the Dalits, there was a catch in that the Dalit candidates would not be elected by Dalits themselves. So effective control and effective power is something that is also part of freedom as growth, as I see it. In some sense, that takes us to the next important point: collective self-determination. So I, as an individual, may be freer than my brothers and my compatriots, but if they are still undergoing the stigma or the disabilities of being in a system which is deleterious or which visits depredations on them regularly, that in some sense makes me unfree. And so in some sense, collective self-determination becomes really important. Finally, self-mastery and self-cultivation. Self-cultivation, in some sense, I've spoken about before, but there should be the possibility for a person who is, in some sense, burdened by prejudices to be able to overcome those prejudices. So now I pivot away from the state of the untouchables to the state of the upper caste. So as an upper caste person, perhaps if I have prejudices, Ambedkar's idea of freedom is expansive enough to suggest that overcoming my prejudices and sort of mastering my inner self, my deeper self, something which Berlin was so suspicious of, should also be part of freedom as growth. I've already spoken about access to material goods and money. So finally to conclude, I would want to suggest that Ambedkarist freedom should be seen as a cluster concept. It should not be seen as one principle, which in some sense, Anglo-American analytic philosophy is obsessed with the underlying master principle, the one thing which sort of explains and unifies everything. Utilitarianism is interested in that one idea of utility maximization. Deontology is interested in that one idea of the moral thing to do is to act in such a way that you fulfill your duties and so on and so forth. So I want to suggest, going back to the quote by John Dewey about pluralism, that if it is intuitive to suggest one principle, it is possible to intuitively speak about 500 principles. You can have multiple values which are important, multiple systems of analysis which in some sense explain human action, and all of them should be accounted for in your theory if you are doing theory building. So the one unified principle, if our Anglo-American brethren are still uncomfortable, the one unified principle is the growth of human capacities, is what Ambedkar would suggest. And freedom is not a static state, but an ongoing process of enabling human development. As Dewey said, that growth is not the end state, but it's an growing process, an ever continuing process. Yeah. I suppose this is the end of my slide, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your patient hearing. I suppose I was only slightly above my time, so I apologize for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Danish, for your impressive and thought-provoking talk on Ambedkarist freedom. I think there are many things to learn from your talk, and there are questions, I hope, from the audience.
I was actually under the impression that iPhone O is Professor Stroud, but he came quite later. So I think iPhone O has joined us from the very beginning. So I thank the person behind the screen.
Right. Well, if there is no question, I can start with my own.
I have a question too.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay, please, yeah.
Yeah, Danish, thank you for giving this talk. Sorry, I was getting the kids ready for school. It's pretty early here in the US, but luckily I think I've seen some earlier versions of these arguments. And so I think it's absolutely awesome that you're talking about growth, because growth is one of these terms that's of so much importance in Dewey. Yet when we talk about Ambedkar, it's there, but we don't talk about it. So we need to talk about it some more, because it's one of these things that could serve as an ideal. One thing, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on. Dewey, he talks in his art as experience about aesthetic experience or consummatory experience. And, I have always read that as a phenomenological reading of the experience of growth. Why? Well, growth and the concept before it in Dewey, progressive adjustment, they seem to be a copy of the master-slave dialectic that Dewey works into his aesthetics, namely an organism, tries to engage an environment with some purposes. The environment pushes back. Reflective thought often helps the creature uses reflection to figure out how to deal with this environment, and then grows from that. And so, on the kind of moral philosophy or epistemology side of Dewey, you get that model as how we get reflective thought and fix things that we want. But on the aesthetic side, Dewey talks about this in terms of the viewer engaging the material of the painting, and it pushes back. And really the beginning chapters of Art as Experience, all their examples are from the natural world. They're not art, proper. So my question to you, put simply, is, do you think there's also a phenomenological side to freedom? Does Ambedkar at any place kind of give us hints or explicitly talk about the feeling of growth? And I've always looked for evidence that Ambedkar had exposure to Dewey's Art as Experience, but I've never found that. I'm sure that book didn't interest him if he would have known about it, because it doesn't speak to the political as explicitly as other Dewey texts like Democracy and Education. So I don't know. It's interesting to think. Maybe that's just navel gazing to talk about the phenomenology of growth. But what do you think about that? The feel of growth from the individual's, aspect.
Yeah. Thank you. That is fascinating. Thank you for the question. I've never really thought about this phenomenological aspect of growth. Now, I suppose the best person to answer this question is the questioner himself, but because he spent a lot more time thinking about these topics. I personally have not found that sort of a view in any of Ambedkar's writings. Although I think the closest sort of candidate for that would be the illustrations on the Buddha and his Dhamma, in some sense, the illustrations on in the marginalia. And I don't know if it was you or some other writer who suggested that when Ambedkar wanted a sculpture of the Buddha for his house, he opted for a particular a Buddha with his eyes wide open, in some sense, rather than closed. And this was the sort of sculpture he commissioned from, was it Burma or Thailand or someplace? I don't know if you can correct me. So in some sense, this notion of artistic experience, of phenomenological experience as growth is missing, except if we want to read some anecdote like that as something that Ambedkar was committed to. I don't know if that answers the question. I do remember attending one event at the Bombay Collective where a folk singer who sort of identifies Ambedkarites sang political songs, and in the middle of two political songs that they sang, they spoke about artistic experience, and they said that as Dalits, the kind of music that we talk about, that we sing and that we play, is not first and foremost to be valued for its artistic experience, but for creating consciousness in society. When we are free as a people, then we will make art which is valued in and of itself for its artistic experience. So in some sense, that sensibility is widespread in the Dalit community. I don't know if its provenance is in any of Ambedkar's own writings or speeches in Marathi. I don't suppose that is the case, but that's the closest I can say on this question. Yeah, thank you.
That's helpful. And I mean, artist experience is just now getting over to India. My advisor, Richard Schusterman's book, Pragmatism Aesthetics, was just translated into Hindi. And I don't think enough people know about the weirdness of Dewey's aesthetics. But really, it's like democracy. Democracy is more than voting for Dewey and Ambedkar. Or aesthetic experience is about more than art for Dewey. Yeah. So he has some interesting views. And Ambedkar, some of these were interesting to Ambedkar. Some of them might not have been. Thank you.
I don't know if this might also be helpful when on the few occasions that Ambedkar spoke about art, he's, again, in his comparative sort of vein, he started comparing Buddhist and Hindu art. And he said that Hindu art begins with begins rather well with sort of valuing human experience and human creativity, but quickly becomes a sort of pastiche or kitsch of itself. And Buddhist art has this vitality, and he goes on and on about that. But I suppose that in some sense represents his own political frustrations with Hinduism and may not be taken super seriously. We have actually somebody who's, now that I got to know from the chat box, the iPhone O is my colleague Srini, who knows a lot more about art than I can. And I suppose that comment may not have gone down really well with him because he's the expert. So maybe Srini might have something to say about that. Yeah, but thank you for.
In any case, thank you for your awesome things you have to say about growth. This is very helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question or comment, Jason.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, it's very interesting talk. Couple of points. One is I'm used to Deweyians talking about democracy. And I find it interesting that you're using the discourse of republicanism. Is that because you're dealing with theories of liberty?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Jason. So I think for the most part that I have engaged in Ambedkar scholarship, we have been talking about democracy all the time. It's just that this particular angle that I found on Ambedkar just happened accidentally. And the story behind this paper is not very inspirational. It's just that I wanted to be part of the special issue that Professor Stroud is coming out with on pragmatism in India, and I wanted to get something in at least. So having read these two essays by Ambedkar critiquing Roman republicanism or the neo-Roman view of liberty, I thought this could be an interesting sort of addition to the literature. And it just so happens that in the last sort of second last slide that I mentioned, Ambedkar is super frustrated once he has experienced a few years of the Indian Republic, that the frequency of his anti-democratic sort of rhetorical statements increases manifold. So you're right that when we speak about Dewey and his contributions and his pragmatism, democracy is the more important idea. But in this case, I wanted to talk about freedom precisely because I just found access to these two unpublished papers where Ambedkar, for the first time, in some sense, takes Republican liberty head on. So the reason for that is just biographical and not anything to do with like Ambedkar's or the predilections of pragmatist political theory in India.
Mhm. Well, if it's an accident, it's a very happy accident because I say that the problem of liberty is simply one of the great problems of our time, and we have this binary positive liberty versus negative liberty. I'm really attracted by this idea of freedom as growth, and especially with a sort of progressive or expansive view of virtue, of development of the human person. So actually, I would like to ask, does Ambedkar talk about how human growth, human development involves developing certain virtues? And does he bring in the Noble Eightfold Path into that as a person grows, they have greater capacity to go on the Eightfold Path?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, so I'm glad that you mentioned the Noble Eightfold Path. My own view is that so Ambedkar's engagement with Buddhism is very interesting, and we should not see Ambedkar's sort of avowal of Buddhist ideas as a straightforward conversion. And this is something that we spoke about the last time we met. But the one thing that Ambedkar takes very seriously in Buddhism is the Noble Eightfold Path. And he's very interested by, or sort of impressed by the figure of the Buddha, the moral nature of the Buddha, the rationalism of the Buddha, the virtues of the Buddha, the Noble Eightfold Path, and all of the virtues that instantiates. So I suppose yes. I mean, I did speak about freedom as self-realization and mastery, and I think I would put the Noble Eightfold Path and the idea of growing in virtues under that head. But I suppose we should not restrict freedom as growth to growth of the moral person or inculcation of virtues, but that is only one element of growth. So, which is why I said something like material wealth is also, or access to material wealth is also part of growth as Ambedkar understands it. Something like political rights and effective political rights and agency is also part of freedom as growth. So it's a holistic concept. That's why I call it a cluster concept. I hope that helps.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, good.
Okay. Let me question. My question is actually related to Jason's second one about Buddhism. I was wondering to what extent the freedom as growth is pragmatist and Buddhist, because I was wondering if he is strictly following some Buddhist doctrines, he may also do some Buddhist endorsement of some doctrines like karma or after death. But to what extent he is pragmatist is my question, because this realization is only within this life, or did you imply something after death as growth, or the growth is just within this life to accomplish or continue entirely or eternally, or not?
Right. Okay. Oh, excellent. Okay. So very interesting. I mean, you have sort of very interestingly brought in this question the notion of growth and also Ambedkar's pragmatist Buddhism together with the notion of karma. But to answer this, I would disaggregate the two, actually disaggregate all three of them, and maybe then bring it together. I hope that's a fruitful way to go about this. So I'm super interested in Ambedkar's Buddhism. I have never been a votary of the idea that Ambedkar, in some sense, was impressed by Buddhist philosophy and accepted it wholesale. That is not true. That is false. We should get away from that idea. Most often, what Ambedkar does is reject ideas, not merely in Hinduism or other Indic religions or philosophies like Jainism, but also Buddhism. So in that sense, he is, in a sense, engaged in imminent criticism of Buddhism also. Because it's important to recognize that the notion of karma is the most problematic conception for the Dalits and for all lower castes. Because what does karma in some sense entail? It entails that my social position and my birth in the family or in the location, caste or class location that occurs, it occurs because of my past karma. So not only am I humiliated and the victim of depredations in this life, I am in some sense also responsible for my depredations. So that's a conception which Ambedkar calls pernicious. He says that this is a pernicious doctrine. And this has never been part of Buddhism. Now, of course, he's writing his so-called Buddhist gospel, the Buddha and his Dhamma, in the 1950s. And he wants his followers to convert to Buddhism. So it clearly, even if he does believe that karma is a very Buddhist doctrine, he's not going to categorically come out and say it. That's my understanding of the kind of rhetorical move he makes. We know from current scholarship that Buddhism and Jainism were the two religions, the Shramana religions or philosophies, where the concept of karma actually emerged. And then it got co-opted by Hinduism. And Hinduism is very assimilative or assimilationist. It has the capacity to assimilate ideas, figures, and gods and goddesses and philosophies and, philosophical moves from multiple regions. So that is how karma got accepted. And then they just ran with the idea of karma and rebirth. And it became sort of less onerous in Buddhism and Jainism, whereas it became far more onerous for the untouchables in the way it was understood by Hindus. So that is one. So, of course, Ambedkar rejects karma. And then when he rejects it, he retains the nomenclature of karma in his texts and redescribes them so as to make it restricted only to this life. And then he expands the notion of karma and sort of displaces it from the individual and puts it on the society as a whole. The idea, how I understand him in that particular passage in the middle of Buddha and his Dhamma, he says that, this is not an exact quotation, but he says that karma would mean something like, if our society does good by the weakest people, the weakest group, then we would be a good society, and that would be good karmic fruit in some sense for us. I suppose I'm butchering the exact language, but the idea is that you're a good society if you do good karma. You're a bad society if you do bad karma. So you can actually judge societies to be good or bad based on the karma they do. Karma just means action. So in this case, it is social action, and it would encompass everything: social policy, the kind of government you have, the kind of moral philosophy, the kind of folk psychology that you may have. So I suppose in that sense, this is how he redescribes karma. Your other point was about how pragmatist is his Buddhism. It's pragmatist in precisely this sense, of his willingness to redescribe ideas which he finds not useful anymore in their original form or in their earlier form. So I have a paper on that actually that's coming out, I suppose, in this journal called The Pluralist, which is, I think, the official journal of this American Pragmatist Association, or the Society of American Pragmatists. And once it comes out, I can hopefully share that with you. Did I miss any part of your question?
The freedom as growth is within this life or even after this life?
I see. So I suppose my view of Ambedkar is that Ambedkar is a materialist in the sense that he does not believe that there's a life after death. Right. He is your typical 19th century materialist. There's a very interesting move that he makes in his Buddha and his Dhamma, where he says that the Buddha was influenced by the sage called Kapila. Kapila was a kind of evolutionary thinker, but who also thought that all of reality can be boiled down to two entities. which is Purusha, which is consciousness, and Prakriti, which is nature. And later philosophers like M.N. Roy, who's one of my interests, he says that Kapila was actually paying lip service to the mainstream of Indian philosophy, basically the Hindus, Advaita, Vedanta, these kinds of people, by postulating this idea of Purusha. Whereas actually, if you look at Kapila's system, you don't need anything but Prakriti. So it's a system of evolutionary cosmology of some kind. So Ambedkar says that Buddha was influenced by Kapila. There is no evidence for that. The only evidence that I could find of any writer ever saying this was this very notorious German materialist called Ludwig Buchner, who was basically the Richard Dawkins of his time. Actually, this is an actual quotation by another scholar who works on Buchner, who says this person was the Richard Dawkins of his time. He was so materialist that he thought that thought is to the brain like urine is to the kidneys. So thought is something that the brain secretes. So he was justly called a vulgar materialist. But Ambedkar, and I suppose he got this from M.N. Roy, or he may have got it from Buchner himself, was open to the idea of taking this suggestion from Buchner and putting it in his gospel and saying that the only figure who ever influenced Buddha was Kapila, this materialist from India, who created this philosophy called Sankhya. Sankhya just means number. Kapila is basically creating a cosmological system where he can put a number onto every ontological category. Prakriti is the primordial category of nature, and then there are parts of Prakriti, and then he puts a number on everything. So that's why it's called Sankhya. I hope that answers the question. So growth restricts itself to life in this world, but the life of the community goes beyond the life of you and I as individuals, right? So the community continues. So in that sense, Ambedkar has this very interesting, sometimes notorious habit of speaking of communities as if they are persons. So he says that at one point, he says rather very controversially that African Americans, and this is related to the topic today because we are talking about slavery. He says that African Americans are undergoing a lot of slavery, but they also happen to enslave when they were in Africa other African Americans. So in some sense, they have also gained the fruit of slavery while they are now bearing the brunt of slavery. So he has this habit sometimes of speaking of a community. He has this habit of speaking about the Muslims as if they are like one continuous entity. And then he also speaks about Dalits, of course, and he has to do that for political reasons, because otherwise, how can he claim that we have been oppressed for 2,000 years without disruption? So continuity is very important for thinking about the social ontology of communities. I hope that answers the question.
Right. Yeah, we could continue in this way much longer, but I think we need to close on this materialist ending of the growth.
Thank you.
Freedom as growth. So on this note, we thank you again, Professor Danish Hamid, and see you again.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you all.